Well, of course, we all know that the growing economic and political power of India, but of course, the challenge that India will face, they're already existing challenges relating to infrastructure, to physical infrastructure, to social infrastructure. So being able to provide universal healthcare and then the other services which an aging population needs. Issues regarding inequality, around economic inequality, which is obviously very big in India, and high levels of poverty, but also the severe gender inequality that we see. And then finally, of course, the issues of fragmentation. How can you keep everybody in the country happy? How can you make sure that there is kind of tolerance and cooperation between different states and between different groups, particularly religious groups? So these are all issues that we see in India at the moment, we've seen in the recent past. And yes, of course, having a grown young population is good for the economy, but unless these other issues, the kind of software of population, are not addressed, then obviously with more people that can become more challenging.
Yeah. And what about whether development is keeping pace with these changes? If you think of how high the youth population is in India, even employment opportunities would be an issue.
Well, of course, this is one of the big challenges in India and in many middle and lower income countries, is what we call the informal economy, in that the jobs which younger people and, well, in fact, all people are going into are not necessarily the jobs where, you're paying tax, where you are properly insured, where you're properly looked after, where you are paying money in, which can develop these kind of the social infrastructure that we were talking about before. These jobs, on the other hand, you see these are what we call informal jobs, where you may have a small shop, you're working for yourself, you're working kind of, you're working in an informal way. It's not what we would call kind of decent employment. And of course, India is really, I think, struggling with trying to formalize the economy. And that's very, very difficult, because it's difficult to encourage people to pay tax, right? To move into that formal sector, and to, because that involves your trust in the government, increasing kind of improving the governance of the country as well. So although they're moving in this direction, of course, this change from an informal to a formal employment system is something which is really a big challenge.
China for many years, Stuart, tried to control its population growth by limiting couples. They were only allowed to have one child. They are now facing different challenges as its population starts to decline.
Well, so, of course, as we have population decline, we have population aging, which I think is really a bigger challenge in China. Because if you've got a smaller number of people who are working, let's say, and you've got a greater number of people who are dependent on that working population, whether or not that's through pensions and health services, social services, and so on, then obviously that becomes a kind of a challenge, right? If you've got fewer people paying in and more people who are kind of taking out, then that's a big issue. But then that's a big issue in many, many countries all over the world. It's a big issue in Australia, for example. And so, of course, what you have to do is you have to look at this from both sides. You have to improve productivity. You have to improve employment rates among the working population. And, of course, you have to find a way to reduce the dependency of the older population. And, of course, that can be done through unpopular reforms like increasing the retirement age, increasing the pension age, which in China at the moment is pretty low by international standards, but also, of course, by improving active aging, by making sure that people are healthier for longer, are able to stay at home for as long as possible, and reducing poverty. All of these things China has been really active in the last few years.
You pointed out Australia and many other countries in Asia and Europe are facing declining populations, but does a population size really matter, or is it more about policy settings?
That's exactly right. There's no such thing as an optimum population size, optimum population structure, optimum population growth. People think that it's, if everyone has 2.1 children, then all the problems will go away. And of course, that's simply not the case. That's simply not true. It's about having decent policies which are responding to these changing demographic circumstances and demographic characteristics. And of course, half the reason why Australia, why in Europe, in North America, we are struggling with these issues is because they've been left for such a long period of time. And whereas in East Asia, and increasingly in new places like in Southeast Asia, which are aging very rapidly, they're having to adapt to this in a much more rapid kind of condensed period of time. And so that's, I think, an advantage which places like China, but then also in Thailand or Singapore or Vietnam have over Australia or over Europe, in that their systems are much younger. It's much easier to adapt and change these systems because people have just not got used to them in the same way that we have in Europe or in Australia or in America.
Yeah, but for a lot of those nations, Stuart, social stability sort of can be impacted by population growth. Could this threaten some governments if they aren't keeping pace?
I think that changing population size is a little bit, and changing population age structure and so on, is a little bit like the rain, okay? If it's raining outside, there's very little that you can do about it, right? If you go outside completely unprepared and you don't carry an umbrella, you're going to get wet, you're going to get uncomfortable. But if you see that it is raining, you can see that actually, how do we adapt to that kind of situation, right? And that if we just kind of go on the way we carry on and we don't make any changes, we're going to get wet, we're going to get uncomfortable. And it's the same with aging, and it's the same with population decline, where rather we just see that this is an inevitable next stage of our human development in every country in the world. And how we lived in the past up until this particular point, if we carry on doing that into the future, this is not going to work out. So we need to adapt to these changing demographic, economic and social paradigms. It would be exactly the same thing with climate change, right? We have to adapt and respond to this completely different situation that we're in order to give ourselves a more sustainable future.
Great to talk as always, Stuart. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.